This is the Human Action Podcast, where we debunk the economic, political, and even cultural myths of the days. Here's your host, Dr. Bob Murphy.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Human Action Podcast. I am rolling solo today, and what I'm going to do is comment on the latest GDP report. But first, I thought to motivate this, let me just read some excerpts from Peter St. Onge's commentary, and partly because the only reason I looked into the details of this GDP report was because of Peter's analysis that I saw on social media. Before I get going into the meat of this stuff, let me just mention at the outset, I like Peter. I've had him on as guest on the Human Action Podcast before, so I'm going to disagree with a couple of his claims in this analysis, but this is very friendly. So here, and it's partly just to motivate this, so you folks can see the contrast, and then hopefully the synthesis between his thesis and my antithesis will provide you with the fullest explanation. Also, let me mention as one last preliminary, if you're able to watch this particular episode, the video version, that's going to be ideal because we are going to flash some charts, and I'm going to go through and show you some of the numbers in the GDP report. It's not essential that you see the video. Like, I'm going to say this stuff out loud, obviously, but it might be easier for you to follow if you're watching the video version. Okay, so Peter on May 2nd had this post come out that's titled, GDP goes negative and it's glorious. And he says, it's official, GDP is negative and it's glorious. Last week, the Bureau of Economic Analysis reported that GDP for the first 3 months of 2025 turned negative for the first time since 2022. All right, and then he's flashing this chart that we'll show here, folks. So this is coming right from the BEA's release, showing you that, oh, yeah, you see how in the first quarter of 2025, the real GDP's percent change from the preceding quarter. All right, just a quibble here, but for purists, GDP wasn't negative. GDP growth was negative. If GDP were negative, it'd be like a black hole. It'd be sucking cars and haircuts into oblivion and be disappearing from the economy. But no, the growth in GDP was negative in the first quarter. And then for context, you can see the BEA's report also showed the earlier, 5 quarters, and you can see that GDP growth was positive in all of them. It was tepid in the first quarter of 2024, but even there, it was still, I'm eyeballing it like around 1.5, 1.6%. And you can see like last quarter, it was well above 2%, okay, positive. And so the fact that it's now negative, that's not good. A rule of thumb, it's not the exact definition, but again, a rule of thumb that people say in these circles is that if you have 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth, that's usually when the NBER, the National Bureau of Economic Research, is going to say, yep, there's a recession for you. You may recall there was a big argument about that during the Biden years where it looked like there was going to be 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth, and a bunch of the progressive Democratic economists made sure to get out in force and explain to everybody ahead of time that, hey, even if that happens, that's not the definition of a recession. Remember that. Okay, so back to Peter's post here. He says, the kicker is all the pain was caused by a 41% surge of imports front-running tariffs. Okay, so again, Peter's saying the reason the official GDP growth statistic, the advanced estimate is what they call it for first quarter of 2025, the reason that's showing up as negative is largely because there was this huge 41% surge in imports, and that was because everybody knew that Trump was saying he's going to raise tariffs, and so, hey, you might as well bring in the goods ahead of time and just put them in the warehouse rather than wait for the tariffs to kick in and then have to pay whatever the number is going to be percent more, right? That was the idea. That's what Peter's saying here. And so then continuing Peter's analysis, he says, the kicker in all of this pain was caused by a 41% surge of imports from front-running tariffs, which GDP bizarrely counts as negative GDP. All right, so what he means is in the GDP formula, and I'll come back to this in a minute, folks, in this episode and spell it out in case you're not familiar, but Peter's right. Yeah, the way the GDP formula works, imports are subtracted. And so that's what he's saying here, that, yeah, because imports surged, that's what's pushing down the GDP number. And he says, drop those, and actual GDP soared by a blistering 4.5%. Okay, so he's saying if you make that adjustment, then the number would have been 4.5% higher. And he thinks that's a correct adjustment to make. That, in other words, it's not that goods flowing into your country somehow reduce output, right? He's saying that's silly, that's the way that they run these numbers. Our capacity to produce isn't impaired just because people are bringing in goods ahead of scheduled tariff increases or anticipated tariff increases. People didn't know exactly what the number was going to be, right? That's not all of a sudden crippling the ability of U.S. industry to make goods and services, right? That's his argument. Okay. And then he says it actually gets better because government spending dropped for the first time since 2022. My colleague E.J. Antoni noted that consumer spending outpaced government spending by 3.2%, also the best number since 2022. Control for that drop in government spending, and the economy grew by nearly 5% on the quarter. All right. And then he says, lastly here, and I'll turn to my direct analysis of the report. So what's driving Trump's boom? Simple. Private sector investment, the mother's milk of prosperity. Okay. And then actually I'll show one last thing that Peter flashed this chart showing contributions to percent change in real GDP. And again, so the first quarter 2025 real GDP change was negative 0.3%. And now what we're seeing here is what are the contributions to that? Okay, so that left amount there that's in orange, that's negative, and that's the thing we're trying to explain. So we're going to decompose that into its components. That's what's going on in this chart. And so they're saying, oh, consumer spending actually rose, investment was way up, which you see. Government spending went down a little bit, so that's why it goes down, down on that zero axis line. Exports were up a little bit, actually. Imports, it's showing down because they are a subtraction out of the GDP figure. Right, so imports surge, but since they're negative, that's why it goes down in this chart. Okay, so the idea is you add up those vertical pluses and minuses, and you're going to get a slight negative, which explains to you why GDP overall went down 0.3%. Okay, and so you can see how that lines up with Peter's commentary where he's saying, yeah, investment's good. We all agree with that, right? And that's way up under Trump because companies are relocating. Government spending is down. The way they do these numbers, that shows up as a lower GDP figure, but we all know as Austro-libertarians that's crazy. That's a good thing. And also imports are pulling down the number, but we also know, particularly when we realize the reason for the surge in imports is simply people pulling in goods ahead of the tariff hikes, that's not a prima facie reason to doubt that U.S. will be able to produce the U.S. economy. And so let's not count that as a subtraction from GDP. And you make all those adjustments, boom, you see why this economy is great, right? So that's his commentary. So I disagree with a few of those particular arguments that Peter put forward. And by the way, let me just mention too, I am a free trader. I still think that other things equal, raising tariffs makes Americans, even American workers specifically, poorer than they otherwise would be. However, I have explained on this podcast and elsewhere that there's a smart way you could do it. That if you put in place tariffs, and particularly if you didn't make the rate too high, and you used the funds that you raised to reduce income taxes, that could totally make sense. Okay, so there's a way that the Trump team, and there are some people in his orbit, particularly Stephen Moran, who's got a PhD in economics from Harvard, I believe, that's the head of Trump's Council of Economic Advisors. If he had the full power to do everything he wanted to do, that could make sense. It might not be the exact package of policies that I would have picked myself, but if it's the status quo versus what he wants to put in place, I probably would pick what he wanted to put in place. I think that would be better overall. So again, this episode is not me saying the Trump team is wrong on this stuff, but what I am pushing back on is some of the turn that frown upside down approach that Peter did with the BEA's report. I don't think quite works. Okay. Last thing I'll say here is now, partly for pedagogical reasons, because I know we have like a lot of homeschooling families that tune into Mises.org for their economic commentary and to teach their kids how to learn Austrian economics. I'm going to go through this a bit slowly and show, like, this is the way you could pull up the BEA's report and find these numbers instead of me just jumping right into, why I disagree with Peter. I'm going to go through it a bit more methodically, but I hope at least some of you will appreciate that in case you want to do this at home. Okay. So specifically, I'm looking here, the BEA, when it comes out with its report, you'll have the press release or whatever, and then you can go and click the full report. The PDF version is what I'm looking at. And then what to me was the most helpful, because they had done all the decomposition that I thought I was going to have to do myself in Excel, is I just flipped ahead to its page 9 of 17 is what I wanted. So it's table 3, gross domestic product, level and change from preceding period. All right. And just to walk through some of this. So it's very useful. They've got on the left and right side, they say line, it's got 1, 2, 3, 4. And so it kind of helps you just keep track, in addition to the shading, the alternating gray and white that allows you just to keep the numbers straight and you can see what the line item refers to. And then also the way they do the indentation, labeling what each row is referring to, gives you a sense of the accounting. Okay, and this will make more sense as I go through it, but I just want to point all that out. And then also, too, a big thing to watch out for is nominal versus what you could call real or inflation-adjusted dollars. All right, so if you just naively go into this and you say, why don't we do it this way? Let me just first here explain to you, if you were looking at this table, how you could come up with the fact that they're saying the headline GDP report is negative 0.3%. Or where's that number coming from? Let me show you, because I bet you a lot of you, if I gave you this table, you wouldn't be able to produce that number exactly. And so you could maybe get close, but you couldn't quite come up with this. So let me show you exactly where that number's coming from. And again, this is partly just for pedagogical reasons. All right, so if you're looking at the left-hand side part, the seasonally adjusted annual rates, that stuff, and you might say, okay, I'm going to go to first quarter 2025, and the level of GDP was 29.9776 trillion. Okay. And first quarter 2025, and then fourth quarter of 2024, and these are these are annualized rates, by the way. Okay, so it's not saying output was a tad under $30 trillion in the first quarter. They're saying if U.S. output were that amount for 4 quarters in a row, that's what the annualized amount would be. Okay, so just to be clear. And you can see that in the table heading. It's a seasonally adjusted at annual rates. And that's another thing, too, is they seasonally adjust it. Okay, that if in the first quarter, or in the fourth quarter, for example, with Christmas and all that stuff, like maybe if certain things are a lot higher than they normally are during the year, they take that stuff into account when they do seasonal adjustments to kind of smooth it out. Okay, but in any event, you can see that number for first quarter 2025 is bigger than the number for fourth quarter 2024, which was 29.7239 trillion. So you say, wait a minute, so GDP went up. Why are they saying it went down? Well, because this is nominal figures, right? These are the actual dollar amounts that they estimate. So yes, more was spent on final goods and services in the first quarter of 2025 than in the prior quarter, but prices in general also rose. And so the idea is once you adjust for the fact that things were more expensive, you see that the real inflation-adjusted amount spent on final goods and services, which is what GDP is trying to capture, went down. Okay, and so there you go, so on the right-hand side of this table, you've got billions of chained 2017 dollars. Okay, so what that means is all of the numbers on this right-hand side, the dollars have been adjusted such that they're 2017 dollars or dollars with the purchasing power of dollars from 2017, which were stronger than dollars in 2025. Okay. And so you can see like the levels there, they're showing the level of first quarter 2025 GDP is only 23.5261 trillion, right? So it's smaller because these are stronger dollars. Okay. But the virtue with this is now they've made that adjustment for all the different periods. And so you can look at the change, for example. So you can say, you see this far right thing saying change from preceding period, first quarter 2025, you see negative 16.3. So that's saying once you make this adjustment of billions of chained 2017 dollars, GDP in the first quarter of 2025 was $16.3 billion lower than it had been in the prior quarter. Okay. And so now you might think, oh, so now we're getting really close to being able to come up with the headline figure, right? Because the headline figure refers to real GDP. So that means inflation adjusted. And so you could say, okay, so what if I took 16.3 and divided it by 23,542.3, right? To see what's the percentage change. And that would get you 0.07%. And you say, what? So that's not a, or negative if you put the negative 16.3 in the numerator, right? So that's not the 0.3 drop that they've been reporting. So, how's that? And the answer is this is just a quarterly change, right? So real GDP dropped by 0.07% in one quarter. And so the idea is if that happened 4 quarters in a row, and you got to get to the exponentiation to do it correctly, do the arithmetic correctly, then you would finally be able to prove that or demonstrate that, yes. So at an annualized rate, real GDP was shrinking at 0.3% over the first quarter of 2025, right? So specifically, since, again, some of your homeschooling, if you take 0.9993, which is, like what you'd multiply to have it go down by 0.07%. So 0.9993 raised to the fourth power is 0.997, which is a 0.3% drop. Okay. Don't worry, folks. I'm not going to get this detailed and pedagogical for the whole thing. I'll speed up now for the adults in the room, but I did want to just walk through that slowly to make sure I'm not losing anybody, and then to show people this is how you read these tables, and that's how you would take these numbers and come up with the headline report of real GDP is down 0.3% at an annualized rate in the first quarter of 2025. Okay, so the way these numbers are organized, again, if you're familiar with accounting, this will make sense to you. But for those who aren't, like I say, the indentation gives you a sense of like what the category's total amount is, and then you can see the decomposition of it. So GDP, you might remember the equation that's taught in textbooks and whatnot. It's one popular version of it is to say GDP equals C plus I plus G plus net exports. All right, and the C stands for private consumption, the I stands for private investment, the G stands for government expenditures, and then net exports is net exports. Okay? And so you can see that's the way this table is organized, that line 2 is personal consumption expenditures, and you can see how that's like left aligned, that the P of personal is right up against the left margin there. And then all the stuff under there, like goods and services, so lines 3 and 14 are slightly indented, but the same amount. So that's showing you that, under the umbrella of personal consumption expenditures, you break it out in terms of goods and services. And then the indentation's even more, and you can see, goods gets broken down into durable goods and non-durable goods. And then even within there, among durable goods, it's motor vehicle parts and furnishings and right? Okay. So the 4 components you can see, it's line 2 is personal consumption expenditures. You scroll down, line 26 is gross private domestic investment. Then you got to go on to the next page to see line 43 is net exports of goods and services. And then finally, line item 50 is government consumption expenditures and gross investment. Okay, so those are the four components. And then, again, within each of them, there's all sorts of line items under their umbrella that they break it out into more specificity. But that's the way to read this. And so those four items add up to the top line gross domestic product figures. Okay, though if you do that and check it, you can see, except for rounding and residual errors and things, those all add up together. Okay? So, going through this now to explain why I disagree with some of what Peter was saying in his rosy commentary. Let me first of all just say the fact that, well, let's look at this first line. And you can see real GDP, this far right number, the change from preceding period, is negative 16.3, right? So again, that's saying once you put everything in the changed 2017 dollars, real GDP in the first quarter of this year was $16.3 billion less than it had been in the previous quarter. Again, at annualized rates. And so it's not so much, I mean, we are going to get into this, but it's not so much to explain the components of that negative 16.3, but you have to say, what's the context here? Like, what's normal? What would we expect to see in a healthy economy? Okay, so if it had just been zero, you would have said, oh, everything's fine. There's nothing bad about the, no, you'd still say, why didn't it grow? All right, so you can see, for example, in the prior period, which is the cell right to the left of that, GDP, real GDP, grew at 142.1 billion compared to the prior quarter. Okay, so that's showing you the change up here. It's not so much merely that GDP fell, it's that it didn't grow. Okay, and so that's partly what we're trying to explain. So as we go through, and let me just anticipate, partly why I'm going through this is the one area where I do agree with Peter's analysis somewhat is where he says the drop in government spending, we really shouldn't be counting as a subtraction from GDP because in general, Austro-libertarians don't think government spending contributes to the economy, right? And so, right, but even there, we're going to see that the drop in government spending was a smaller number than 16.3 billion. And so even on its own terms, that doesn't explain the full fall, but I'm saying even if it did, even if government spending fell by 40 billion, let's say, you still wouldn't conclude, oh, so everything must be fine because GDP only fell by 16.3, and once you take account of the government spend, because no, again, the baseline, what you normally would expect in a decent growing economy is that number would be positive of, over 100 billion. And so the fact that it actually fell is alarming. Okay. So let me now just comment on a couple things here. So if we look at under gross private domestic investment, remember that one of the things Peter was arguing is that there was this big surge in investment spending in terms of, right, C plus I plus G plus net exports. And so the I went way up, and that was one of the positive trends, as the BEA's own bar chart showed. And Peter was attributing that to, oh, yes, companies are relocating. I didn't read all the excerpts of his post. Obviously, I'll link to it, folks. You should go read it yourself just to make sure, you're getting the both sides here. But he was arguing that, yeah, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence and cases that he's covered in prior posts talking about companies that are relocating their manufacturing in the United States, right? That's one way a multinational corporation can get around Trump's tariffs is just to go ahead and have the products produced in the U.S. And that's obviously right up the alley of the MAGA folks who are supporting Trump's Liberation Day tariff regime. They're saying, yeah, we want companies, if we're just building products to sell to Americans, how about you do it here and hire American workers to make the stuff instead of just, offshoring in order to save a bit on, wage costs and take advantage of lax environmental regulations and whatnot, right? So that's the argument. But what I'm saying here is I don't see that jumping out in this particular report, all right? So Peter talked about how there's all sorts of future prosperity that's coming shortly, that's just around the corner. because of all these companies that are bringing operations back in the U.S. He might be right, he might be wrong. I'm just saying here, that surge that we saw in the private investment statistic, I don't think you can say, oh, that's because companies are relocating here. So specifically, you could see this line 26, the gross private domestic investment, it is up this quarter, $218.6 billion. But when you say, okay, so how much of that are companies coming back in? Well, one thing you could check out is under fixed investment, non-residential, right? Because we're not talking about people building houses for people to live in. We're talking about like factories and stuff. And then you look at structures, and you can see that particular subcategory of this was only up 0.6 billion, right? $600 million. And you say, well, give me a frame of reference. Is that a big number? Well, in the fourth quarter, it was up 4.8 billion. Okay, so there's nothing to write home about the boost in non-residential structures in terms of the components that go into gross private domestic investment. I'll show you what was a big number. If you look down at line item 40, which is the change in private inventories. Okay, so that's another, besides fixed investment, that's another of the big subcategories that together add up to gross private domestic investment. Okay, and you can see, again, look at this line 40, first quarter of 2025, that was $131.3 billion higher than it had been prior quarter. And to give a frame of reference, in the fourth quarter, it actually dropped $49 billion. Okay, so again, what that means is these are all, again, seasonally adjusted, inflation adjusted, and annualized numbers. But they're saying in the fourth quarter, private inventories declined by $49 billion, whereas in the first quarter of 2025, they rose by 131 and change billion dollars. Okay, and so that gets counted as part of private investment. And why is that? Because again, big picture here, what we're trying to do with GDP is measure the production of final goods and services in the United States. And for various reasons, probably most importantly, the availability of the good data, we have much better means of assessing expenditures. So that's why, like, we measure how much consumers spent. We can measure how much government spent on various things. And so we can see how much did businesses spend on inventory. Okay. But again, the logic here is it's not ultimately spending we're trying to measure. We're trying to measure and estimate production. And so the idea is, if let's say there were a bunch of shirts that were produced, even if the consumers didn't buy more shirts and the department stores just put them all in the back rooms or in their warehouses, just bulking up and getting ready, let's say, they're bulking up ahead of time because there's going to be the brisk shopping season that's coming up, but it didn't happen yet, and they're just getting ready for it. Still, that production is happening now, this period, this quarter. And so that's why you want to have change in private inventories, just to make it more specific that you can allocate the production to when it actually happened. So yes, in the grand scheme, in a normal life cycle, stuff is physically produced, then it might be added to inventories, and then eventually it's sold to the consumer. And so if you just measured the consumer buying stuff, that would be fine. You would eventually catch it. But the point is, in case there's a time lag, that it's more accurate to isolate it and say, oh, no. When it first bolsters the private inventories, that's when closer to when the production must have occurred. Okay. And so that's what's going on here. So you can see of that $218.6 billion increment in gross private domestic investment, $131.3 billion was just the surge in private inventories. Now, what's concerning about that is, okay, well, that's good. For some reason, the businesses all told their factories, hey, crank out a bunch of stuff and we're just going to load it up into the warehouses, even though the consumers haven't bought it yet. No, that's not great in and of itself, because looking ahead to line item 43, we see net exports of goods and services this period dropped 321.7 billion compared to the prior period. All right. So in other words, the trade deficit was $321.7 billion higher, again, with inflation adjusted annualized rates here, seasonally adjusted too, was that much higher. And specifically, you go to line item 47, it's because imports surged $333.3 billion compared to the prior quarter. Okay. And so, Peter acknowledged all that, but my point is that surge in private domestic investment, a big chunk of that was the swelling of private inventories. And then when we couple that with our knowledge that, and imports surged also, I think it's clear, these numbers don't literally prove that this is the case. You can imagine hypothetical scenarios where these numbers are the same and what I'm about to say isn't what happened. But I think given our knowledge of the situation, it seems pretty clear what happened is, all these firms that rely on foreign imports for their business model, when they knew that, Trump is coming in and it looks like they're really going to get ready to hike tariffs and they're serious, they went ahead and just did massive bulk orders rather than, having it spread out over the year like they normally would have. They just went ahead and accelerated it and just brought in a bunch of stuff quickly. And so that showed up as a surge, and stored it because, their customers don't want to buy at 5 times the normal rate, right? So they went ahead and just brought everything into the country at the original tariff rates while they could and threw it in the warehouse, added it to private inventory. And so that showed up as a surge in private inventory, but it also showed up as a surge in imports. And so now we see why you, quote, subtract imports from GDP. It's not making a causal argument that somehow imports make your economy less productive or something in a physical, technological way or something. No, it's just saying in terms of the accounting, the way, or put it this way, forget the private inventories because that's another layer of complexity. Just in general, if Americans buy $1 billion worth of flat screen TVs that were made in China, well, the $1 billion they spend on the TVs, that is measured in consumption spending, right? So when you do GDP equals C plus I plus G plus net exports, the $1 billion the American consumers spend on TVs from China makes the C $1 billion higher. And that's incorrect because those TVs were made in China. GDP is supposed to be measuring final goods and services produced in the US. So the fact that the consumption spending catches foreign made goods means you need to subtract that out. And so that's why you subtract the import figure. That if there was $1 billion of imports, then you subtract that out when you do minus the net exports, right? Technically, you're adding exports and subtracting imports. That's the same thing as saying add net exports, right? So that's why you, quote, subtract it from GDP. It's because you already added it erroneously, right? So you're not making GDP lower than it otherwise would have been. All you're doing is correcting for the erroneous addition of something in a different part of the formula that really doesn't belong there. And so you're just correcting for it. Okay. So again, with here, I'm saying because that gross private domestic investment figure, to the extent that businesses did import a lot and then add a bunch of stuff to their inventory, the stuff that could be stored, obviously. Again, the way they do the standard accounting on this, that would show up as a big surge in change in private inventories, and it would be incorrect to just say, so see, GDP is higher because those things weren't produced here. That's why you subtract the imports. Okay. Also, let me just mention too, I have seen some commentators saying that, private inventory surged, and then now over time, over the coming quarters, as the consumers, buy down those inventories, that will show up and contribute to GDP in those future periods as well, because then it'll just be consumer spending. But again, no, it won't. And it shouldn't, right? If by hypothesis we're talking about inventory swelled, and if that counted right now, if it was domestically produced product that went into inventory, well, you wouldn't want to count it again if 2 quarters from now consumers buy off and empty the warehouses down. because that hasn't been produced there if we already counted it. Or if it was foreign made, then we're not including it in this period's GDP when it swells the inventories, and we're correct in doing that, right? Because it wasn't produced here. And then also in the future, if consumers buy it and pull down the inventory, we wouldn't want it at that point to count towards GDP then either, because again, that's not correct. It wasn't made here. It was just made abroad and was brought into the warehouses, and then in the future, it's going to get sold to somebody. Okay, so the way that gets handled, it doesn't matter. Once it's in the warehouse and in private inventory, it doesn't matter where it came from. Going forward, the sale of it to the consumer, there's two offsetting adjustments. On the one hand, the consumer spending on, let's say, the flat screen TV that's sitting in the warehouse shows up and contributes to GDP through that component or through that, variable. But then private inventory adjustment would be negative because of that unit, right? So if the consumers spend $1 billion buying flat screen TVs that were stored in the warehouse, C is $1 billion higher, but then I is $1 billion lower because the change in private inventory would be $1 billion less because of those particular purchases. So it's a wash, which again, that's not weird. That's exactly what you would want. It's not indicating U.S. production if there were a bunch of product sitting in a warehouse that then the consumers buy that period. Doesn't matter where it came from. If it was domestically produced, then back when it went into inventory, that would have been a net contribution to GDP that period, right? Because there would have been a positive change in inventory and there wouldn't have been a higher import number because of that surge if it was domestically produced product. So that's exactly what you want. And so that period it would have been booked, GDP would have been that much higher. But then again, later when you draw down the inventory, that shouldn't contribute to GDP, but it also doesn't subtract from it either, right? So again, it's exactly what it's supposed to be. If you do, once you understand the accounting, that people spending money on goods that are just coming out of inventory, the consumption number picks it up, and then the change in private inventory subtracts it, so the net is zero. Because again, people buying TVs that were stored in a warehouse doesn't make your economy produce less, right? It's like in terms of cause and effect or the numbers, it's just saying that per se isn't a measurement one way or the other. Let me mention, if you like this stuff, one of my favorite all-time articles that I wrote for Mises.org, partly just because I thought the title was quite clever, was back in, I think it was 2010. And the title we gave to it was Inventories Don't Kill Growth, People Kill Growth, right? That's sort of a play on words from the gun debate. The guns don't kill people, people kill people. Okay, and so specifically, there had been a GDP report that came out back then. I think it was the other way around. I think that it was showing GDP growth was good, right? Because it was the Obama years. And so a bunch of right-wing pundits were trying to explain it away and say, no, GDP actually isn't good. That's just a statistical artifact from what they call an inventory bounce. Okay, so it's not worth getting into right now in this episode here. But if you're interested in that, I will link to it at the show notes page. Go check it out. Because once I unpack the rationale, and again, the BEA's own analysis showed the decomposition of the factors contributing to the GDP number, and it was showing inventory having a big effect, and it was just goofy, right? What was going on there? So, big picture, it makes sense to track changes in private inventory because that better isolates the timing of when the production actually occurred. But then when they kind of like take the second derivative, if you want to think of it like that, and look at the contributions to the change in real GDP, it gets goofy. And so specifically, last thing I'll say about that 2010 article to give you a teaser, once I explain to you, the reader, what they have in mind and why the BEA was reporting things the way they were, I then constructed a hypothetical scenario showing the absurdity that way of thinking would lead you into, where specifically I had a hypothetical simple economy where inventory was zero in one period, right? Like the warehouses were all empty, and inventory was zero in the next period, right? So there was no inventory in the first period or in the second one. And I showed how using their methodology, you would end up reporting that, a big part of the change in GDP was driven by an inventory adjustment, even though inventory didn't change, and it was zero in both cases. And so I would say, see how goofy this is, that clearly inventory is not causing anything to change in terms of the output in the economy and workers being able to go to work and make stuff. Right. So anyway, I'm just saying that some of the language around this stuff when they report the contributions to the real GDP change are goofy. Okay. Again, you want to learn more about that, look at the show notes page. Okay. So back to what we're talking about here. The last thing, let me just mention, if we go down to line item 50, we see that total government expenditures first quarter 2025 were down $14.5 billion. For a frame of reference, in fourth quarter 2024, they were up $30 billion. So yes, on this point, I agree wholeheartedly with Peter. That's great. And then specifically, you can look at the decomposition. At the federal level, it was down $19.8 billion, largely driven by an $18 billion, again, this is all inflation, blah, 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 adjusted, drop in defense spending. Okay. And then that was partially counterbalanced, though, that at the state and local level, it rose by 4.9. So that's why the combined government at all levels was only down 14.5, even though at the federal level, there was a bigger cut. Okay, so yes, I agree with Peter on that. Couple things here as we wrap up. Number one, don't get confused when we talk in terms of GDP figures about government expenditures. It doesn't just mean money that the government spends. In particular, Social Security payments do not go into these figures, right? That's just considered a transfer. And you can see this on the table. If you look over at the regular nominal figures, you can see that government consumption expenditures, for example, like for all of 2024, you can see we're just a tad under $5 trillion. All right. So you can see that the government is spending more than just that. Okay. Oh, also, because look at line item 51 to make it clear for you folks, that in case you're saying, no, isn't that kind of what the government's budget is? The federal amount, right? So look at 2024, the federal amount, line 51, you can see this expenditures was 1.867 trillion, right? So clearly the federal government spent a lot more than $1.867 trillion in all of 2024, right? And so that's what I'm saying is this line item here, when it goes to contributing to GDP, it's government consumption and gross investment spending. And so it's like, to the extent that the government itself acts as a consumer and invests, like, if a local government builds a bridge, that goes into GDP. But if they're just sending unemployment insurance checks to somebody, or like the stimulus checks that went out during COVID, that doesn't count to GDP. That's just a transfer, the way they do these things, right? The government's not buying something by sending you Social Security checks the way they're buying something if they hire the TSA to go and, pat you down at the airport. Again, there's a sense in which we'd say maybe that's not contributing to actual output in terms of consumer welfare, but you do see the qualitative conceptual difference between the government hiring people to do something versus just sending checks. Okay. So in any event, just want to be clear about that. But then also, last thing I'll say on this point, even though, again, I agree a reduction in government expenditures, consumption and investment, even though that does, other things equal, mean GDP goes down, but yet as an Austro-libertarian, I don't think that actually that's signifying anything. Nonetheless, it's not obvious to me that the way you would correct for that is simply to add it back in and to say, really, a drop in government expenditures doesn't hurt the economy the way, mainstream economists think, certainly progressive economists. And so rather than relying on a misleadingly lower GDP figure. Let's go ahead and, so like if the government cuts spending $100 billion, it's not obvious that the way to correct for that is to just add $100 billion to whatever the GDP figure number that the BEA publishes is. Because yes, if the government doesn't spend as much, that frees up those resources. And so presumably, at least after there's time for the economy to adjust, that would show up as higher consumption and investment or net export figures, right? So that's my point here, that, for example, at the end of World War II, the government drastically reduced military spending, but you saw a huge surge in consumption and in particular in private investment. All right, so it wasn't dollar for dollar. There was a bit of a lag where the drop in total government spending was not perfectly offset by a spike in private consumption and private investment, but it was mostly offset. All right, so again, my point is it would be an overcorrection, certainly at an annual frequency. Maybe at a quarterly, you could say there wasn't enough time for those resources to get reallocated. But I hope I'm making my point clear here that even though I agree with Peter, a cut in government spending does not signify a bad economy. And even though it's true, the official GDP figures include government expenditures as if they're of the same, footing, on the same footing as private consumption or investment. Even though I concede all that and agree, the fact that the BEA's analysis shows, part of why we were reporting a 0.3% drop in real GDP is because of these cuts in government spending at the federal level, I would think that might partly just show up elsewhere as a boost in C&I. So in other words, the official government's GDP figure shouldn't be lower than it otherwise would have been. That's what I'm getting at. And because of that, I think it would be an overcorrection to just add the number back in and say, really, actual correctly measured GDP is this much higher now. Because again, I think some of that would have already filtered back in boosting C&I. Okay, well, I think that's a good spot to wrap up. So big picture takeaway, I am still open to the idea that if they supplemented it with other policies and if they provided more guidance and brought down some of the rates, that the introduction of tariffs could be coupled with a sensible, broader reform package. I don't like the way they've been doing it thus far, but in any event, I'm still open to that and am optimistic that, or I'll leave hope open that they could go ahead and do something good with this. But prima facie, this first quarter GDP report does not bode well. And I think some of the commentary I've seen from Peter St. Onge and others trying to show why, once you make some adjustments here that are perfectly lined up with economic theory, you see that this is actually a really great report. I don't think the numbers bear that out. Okay, so futures open. Maybe we'll end up having a good economy. Right now, I don't think that's what's going to happen. Okay, folks, thanks for your attention. See you next time.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. In the meantime, you can find more content like this on Mises.org.